I must also vote guilty as charged. And you, Captain?
Guilty as charged.
Bridge to all decks. Time now for a brand new episode of Enterprise Incidents with Scott and Steve. I'm Scott Nance.
And I'm Steve Morris, and I'm very happy that we're continuing our exploration of the Menagerie with part 2, and I'm even happier to welcome back to Enterprise Incidents actor, voiceover artist, podcaster extraordinaire, movie critic, and my very, very good friend and partner on the Cine-Files, John Rocha. Welcome back to Enterprise Incidents.
Thank you. And you forgot hardcore Star Trek enthusiast. That is number one since birth. So I'm so excited to be back to talk about this incredible two-parter from the first season, The Menagerie. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Steve and Scott, for having me back.
Well, the thing about this episode is that this is going to be the only two-parter that we're going to have on Enterprise Incidents because it's the only two-parter that the original series had. It wasn't always planned that way. There was supposed to be another two-part episode that was supposed to happen earlier in the first season at the end of the Naked Time when the Enterprise goes back in time after trying to get away from planet Psi 2000. They're supposed to slingshot away from the planet and go back in time to the Earth of the 1960s, which would have effectively kicked off part 2, which turned out to be Tomorrow is Yesterday. But you know what? That's okay because it all worked out. The Naked Time is a great one-part episode. Tomorrow is Yesterday is a great one-part episode that I cannot wait to talk about when we get to it on Enterprise Incidents. But because we went through all of the details regarding the production and the development of the Menagerie as a whole, we can kind of just cut to the chase here and jump right into our deep dive play-by-play of part 2 of the Menagerie. And for those of you who are listening to part 2 of Enterprise Incidents before you listen to part 1, well, you got a lot of catching up to do. Make sure you listen to part 1 of Enterprise Incidents because there is a whole great story about how the Menagerie came to be. A lot of it was creative. Some of it was practical. Some of it was pride and ego on the part of its creator, Gene Roddenberry, to show as much of the cage, which cost more than $600,000 to make, as he could. And we're going to see most of the cage now in part 2 of the Menagerie. And because of that, the director who is credited with the Menagerie is actually Robert Butler. Robert Butler directed the cage. But Robert Butler did not direct the envelope portion of the newer footage in the Menagerie. That went to Mark Daniels. But because most of the footage in part 1 was the new footage, so Mark Daniels got credit for directing part 1 of the Menagerie. But because most of the footage in part 2 is actually the cage footage that Robert Butler directed, he is the one who got the credit for directing part 2. And the irony is that you would think that this director, Robert Butler, who basically directed the very first Star Trek episode ever made, would look back on Star Trek and what it created with the fans and the other shows and the movies and be like, yeah, I started that. But he was quoted as saying, I'm not quoting his exact quote, but he actually made comments later on that he just didn't get Star Trek. He thought it was too square-jawed and heroic, and he knows it has fans, and good luck to them.
It's such an interesting thing that all of these creators had to reckon with this thing that maybe they worked a week or two on, or even just a day or two, that ends up being the most important and famous thing they ever worked on. Star Trek certainly has that legacy. We start off at a teaser, and Scott, I've been saying something throughout this whole series about how theatrical and non-realistic Star Trek can be sometimes. This teaser is the perfect example because it opens with this very abstract shot of Captain Kirk, and then the camera pans back to reveal Spock, and both Kirk and Spock are facing forward, and then the camera pulls back even farther to Commodore Mendez profile looking right to left.
How do you plead to the charge of unlawfully taking command of this starship? Guilty of sabotaging the computers of this vessel and locking it on a course for planet Talos IV. Guilty.
And it is so not in the real world in any way. And all of this gets us to is to explain how we got there.
Yeah, but don't you like that?
I love it. I absolutely love it.
I think it's great. I mean, instead of just starting the teaser with last week on Star Trek and just showing clips, which I mean, obviously this teaser definitely does show some last week on Star Trek clips, but the way that it's shot, it's not even like they're back in the briefing room during the hearing. Like it's black. It's completely black background, and like you said, the way they're standing there, it's a very stylized way.
Totally.
To direct this teaser, and I think that it's a great way to direct the teaser. And let me tell you something: when I was watching the Menagerie for the first time, because they aired it as a TV movie, they never showed the teaser.
Oh, right.
When they started showing part 2, they got to the end of Act 4 on part 1, took a commercial break, and they just came back with the captain's log that kicks off Act 1 of Part 2. So I never saw the teaser for the Menagerie until the VHS or, actually the Betamax version came out in 1985. And I remember even by that stage of my life, I think I was 16 years old. And I was still seeing something new from Star Trek, the original series, that I had never seen before. So I thought that was really cool.
John, we've been talking about this for a long time.
Yeah.
What do you think about the theatricality, the time when Star Trek is not actually just realistic?
Mm-hmm. You mean some of the moments where they pan, they close up, or the turns and the slow and the quick close up? Is that what you mean?
Well, and some of the sets are very sort of abstract, and some of the we talked about it with Enemy Within, where Kirk's acting is so big, and the way it's filmed is very much not just straight up realism.
Right.
It's theatrical.
I think this is one of the gifts of discovering Star Trek as a young kid, because you're not looking for Oscar-winning performances when you're watching these shows. So for me, when I go back and watch them now, it's nostalgia. So the nostalgia kind of covers up all of that and kind of allows me to enjoy it. Whereas other films or other shows, you might say, oh, they look dated. There's a certain kind of place that this occupies that it does that in my mind. I can't put that kind of criticism on it. And I enjoy that. And I'm sure a lot of British people would say that about old Doctor Who, that that's even more cheesy, even less budget, but they have a special place in their heart for some of those sets and some of those acting performances from the early Doctor Who episodes. And that's why you cast the way you do. So the charm of the actors come through no matter what they're doing, their essence. And that keeps you enjoying the show, even when you watch it 40, 50 years later.
But, when you look at the look of Star Trek, there's no other show that looks like the original series.
Yes,
nothing.
bright. Yeah.
Certainly nothing before it, because most of what came before it was actually in black and white.
Right.
And that brought us to Star Trek, which was one of the first series to be done in color. And as a result, the producers, Desilu, they were told to use as many of the bright primary colors as they could, which is why you have the uniforms, which really stick out. But also, John, I have talked about this cinematographer over and over again, because his contribution, his impact on Star Trek cannot be overstated. It's Jerry Finnerman. His lighting on, especially the first season and the first 2 seasons of the original series, which was most of what he did, was just so beautiful. It was like every single scene was shot and filmed like a work of art. And I just think that that's one of the reasons why the original series really holds up, is because it doesn't look cheesy. It actually looks beautiful.
Yeah, and just to be fair to both sides, I think the men are shot really well as well. Very we're 3 straight dudes, so we're looking at the women, but I'm sure there are women and men who are looking at the men and the tight clothes. I mean, Jeffrey Hunter's butt is in some tight black pants for a majority of the. Let me just put that out there. When he's running into the room there to go down the elevator to go down, you can see almost his underwear through his pants there, because the way
I never noticed that.
The way the light hits his butt, because of how the HD remastered ones look, you can see completely his whatever he's wearing there and running into the. So there is a kind of way that it's shot that is sexy sci-fi for sure, and that's great. Do you know what I'm saying? And yes, maybe you're objectifying him a little bit, but there's other stuff going on that isn't about the objectification of these people.
I just have this image now of the guys developing HD technology going, someday they're really going to see some old actors' butts really clearly. This is going to be great.
Nothing will be able to be hid.
Yeah. In Act 1, we come back to the trial, and we basically, and this is going to be most of this episode, is little bit in the trial world, and then we immediately go into the world of the cage, and that is where Captain Pike is. He is in the cage behind the glass wall, and he has his first interactions with the Keeper.
It appears, Magistrate, that the intelligence of the specimen is shockingly limited.
This is no surprise, since his vessel was baited here so easily with a simulated message.
This is where I enjoy sci-fi, and I think all of us enjoy sci-fi, right? It's the conversation about principles, about what's happening. This idea of this person has captured you and they're monitoring you like some kind of zoo animal or experiment. And what's it like as a human being to be on the other side of that? Because we've done that for centuries. So I like the conversations they're having. And it's really interesting to watch Jeffrey Hunter reacting to the Talosian, the head Talosian, who is like guessing everything, the keeper, who's guessing everything he's going to do before he does it or as he's doing it.
Next, frustrated into a need to display physical prowess, the creature will throw himself against the transparency.
And having that kind of remove some of your agency, how do you react to that as a human being? So I love, this is where sci-fi to me is always the most fascinating in these kinds of conversations and interactions.
Well, you're also getting a really good look at the Keeper, at the makeup for sure, and the wardrobe. And like you pointed out in the previous episode, John, it is just fantastic. It's among the very best makeup work that the original series ever had.
I agreed.
One of the things that just occurred to me is that in almost all the Star Trek episodes we've covered, things start out in a relatively benign way and then become more and more serious until we're in a desperate situation. And that's where No Man Has Gone Before, that's Corbomite, that's Charlie X, that's Miri, that's all of them. This is not that. This is almost from the beginning. We put our main character in an entirely hopeless situation. He is trapped, totally outmatched, doesn't know what's going on, literally a prisoner in a cage, and that is very different.
Now, our tests indicate the planet's surface without considerably more vegetation or some animals, simply too barren to support life.
So we just thought we saw survivors there, Mr. Spock.
Exactly. An illusion.
And we're in the briefing room with Mr. Spock, but we're also in the briefing room with Dr. Boyce, with Lieutenant Tyler, and with Number One. This is a scene that we would see time and time again throughout the original series, obviously with Kirk and Spock and McCoy and Scotty and everybody else. And I was thinking about the scene in The Naked Time when they're in the briefing room trying to determine like what could have caused the base on the planet to freeze up and for everyone to die in such an unusual way. So when I was watching the Menagerie, I was really kind of thinking, wow, they really had this whole thing down from the beginning. Like they knew exactly what they wanted a briefing room scene to look like, that even when they switched the characters, it still worked. But also I started thinking, well, how would The Naked Time have looked with Captain Pike and Dr. Boyce and Number One, like with that crew analyzing a situation episode after episode? It just made me wonder, like, what if, how that dynamic would have played out, how it would have looked, how it would have felt, how it would have affected decisions that were made and the way things were written, because they would be writing to characters that were very, very differently. But still, you absolutely have to admire Gene Roddenberry and the writing of that scene, and of course Robert Butler's direction of that scene for just like really nailing that so perfectly from the very beginning.
I read most strongly a recent death struggle in which it fought to protect its life. We will begin with this.
And then Pike suddenly isn't in the cage. He's on some planet. There's a castle in the distance, and there is Vina.
Come on! We must hide ourselves.
This is Rigel 7.
What do you think, John, about this as an action sequence?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's obviously manufactured so that he can be challenged. And although Vina's the one telling him it happens for real, it happens for real. It's everything that happens here is real. There is this feeling of this is about motivating his testosterone, his manhood, and having him overcome this dude is a way to kind of inspire him to get caught up in that moment and perhaps be even more connected to Vina in protecting her, especially because he doesn't really unleash the fury until the guy attacks her. But as you're watching him with 2021 eyes, like you can see the staged choreography of the fight sequence. So Steve, the juxtaposition between what we talked about in the first part, where you enjoyed Spock's fight with the dude in the computer room.
Right.
This is not that good because you can
That's what
see
I
him,
think too.
the larger dude, pausing on the spins before he swings, and he makes these over pro wrestling type size over swings in moments that don't feel as threatening as they would like to think they would.
I totally agree. You know what the thing that occurred to me? I mean, obviously the whole theme of The Cage is fantasy, is what are the dreams and fantasies that live in your mind? And it occurred to me watching it this time, man, this is so the classic nerdy kid fantasy. I'm going to be suddenly in a situation and the beautiful girl that maybe I would never have a chance with is getting, attacked by the bully, and I'm going to stand up to the bully and defeat him and save the girl, and then she's going to like me. I mean, that is as classic fantasy as you can possibly get.
Yeah.
And by the way, John, when Steve asked you that question, he definitely had a motive because
he always does.
When we discussed this on the very first episode, because we did The Cage first.
Right.
I remember he said he did not like the way that scene played out. So I could tell right away as soon as he asked that question, he was like, "Oh, here we go."
Yeah.
He's throwing the hook, and let's see if John takes the bait. Now, I hear both your points, but. None of that ever bothered me, and I didn't notice it. Certainly didn't notice it then, and I don't notice it now. I mean, maybe now I notice it a little bit after Steve talked about it. But I love this scene for a number of reasons. For one thing, when the dissolve happens and the keeper presents the illusion of Rigel 7, the music that kicks in, that gorgeous score from Alexander Courage, that is it's beautiful, and it is establishing this alien world, and the matte painting of the temple, even by 2021 standards, that is a gorgeous painting. And they used it again in the third season episode Requiem for Methuselah. And when Vina is running off back to the temple, and Pike goes after her, when the warrior breaks in, and the warrior does look cheesy, like the crooked teeth and the grunting and the growling. It is definitely staged and choreographed in a way that maybe it doesn't hold up, but I still enjoy and appreciate it for what it is. And you're getting to see something that you never saw Captain Pike, Jeffrey Hunter, do again, which is really do an action scene. I mean, some of the best scenes with Kirk are the fight scenes. How would Pike have fought Khan in Space Seed, even with the obvious stuntmen, or Ben Finney in Court Martial, or Finnegan in Shore Leave? How would Captain Pike how would Jeffrey Hunter have been during those scenes? It's a lot of stuff about the Menagerie, watching these scenes from The Cage, that make you go, I wonder what this show would have looked like.
Well, something Steve mentioned in the last part, right? He said you write to the actors that you get. I don't think either this or in the Cine-Files, you said a writer, once they realize what actors are going to be part of their cast, they write to those actors' strengths. I don't think we have a Khan episode with Jeffrey Hunter. I don't think we have half of those episodes you're speaking about, Scott, or any of them possibly, because Hunter is not that kind of actor in terms of his portrayal of the captain. So I can't imagine Hunter going, Khan, what are you doing here? Like, it just would be completely different in his approach. So you'd have to write a villain that makes sense for Hunter, which is why I think the Talosians are great kind of antagonists, not villains necessarily, antagonists for Hunter, because that fits for what he's doing. Whereas if you had Khan, I think Khan would absolutely run rings around Captain Pike, in at least this version of it, because he has so much questions about himself. Whereas with Shatner, it's more of organic, primal kind of back and forth. Do you know what I'm saying?
I think that is a fabulous point. And one of the things you see in all of the great villain situations is great villains match up with their hero. You know what I mean? Is that there's a reason that Joker is probably the greatest villain in comic books, is that he's not a Superman villain. Right. He's not a Flash villain. He's a Batman villain. Yep. Is that there's something that, like, Kirk's particular swagger, his particular arrogance is something that makes Khan a perfect foe for him.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that's a really, really interesting point.
Okay, so you say arrogance. I say confidence. You know, there is a confidence to Kirk that has, you know, I follow this guy into an active volcano. Is how much confidence he exudes.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's an arrogance to it too. Like, I mean, Yang, you see it sometimes, like in Conscience of the King, when Spock says, "How did you know this lady was coming aboard?" And he goes, "I'm the captain." You know, but I do think that, who knows, maybe Jeffrey Hunter, you know, once he got the feel for it, once he hit his stride, maybe Jeffrey Hunter would have dialed it up. But all these maybes and what ifs.
Yeah.
I think we lucked out with Shatner. I think we lucked out that
yeah.
Jeffrey Hunter did not want to do Star Trek, and that they went after Jack Lord and they went after Lloyd Bridges to be the new captain of the Enterprise. And when they got Shatner, they just lucked the hell out, because from Act 1, Scene 1, you know, Kirk was the role he was born to play.
Right.
So after Vina and Pike get returned to the cage, we go back to the trial, and the monitor has stopped showing the video, and the reason is that Captain Pike is fatigued. And this is I think this is a key piece of, let's say, evidence that the Talosians care about Captain Pike. And when the Commodore pushes Spock, like, well, why?
If you'll be patient, sir, the answers to your questions.
You're forgetting you're on trial, Spock. You will answer all questions put to you.
My answer to your question would be quite unbelievable, sir. I regret we'll have to wait and see it there.
What he is pointing out is that the illusions feel real. He's setting up why he wants to be bringing Pike back to the Talosians. And look at Pike's state now with the wheelchair, and he can't even talk. You know, he's just got a flashing light to say yes or no, and that is it. He's a prisoner within himself. So I think it's good that they take these breaks that make sense to the plot in an effort to sort of be like, this is, you know, lead up to why I'm doing this.
It builds the delay with the audience too. Like, oh, we get to take a moment to like absorb what we just saw, process it, and then move forward when they start showing the footage again. And also, I love the double meaning of the cage, right? The cage is what he's in the pilot, and the cage is what he's in now in the Menagerie with his body, the cage of his body, the cage of the wheelchair. That is another version of the cage. So these connective tissues here with these two episodes, in essence, melded together is brilliant.
That is a brilliant depiction, and I never thought about that, but you're right. The cage isn't just what Pike is trapped in on Talos IV. The cage is what he is trapped in within himself now because of the accident. That's a great way to put it, John.
I 100% agree. I think it's a great point. This is where I feel like the envelope portion is just not as strong as I wish it could be. And it's funny, John, when you and I did The Matrix years ago on the Cine-Files, one of the things I brought up is just the famous line, it's in all the trailers, of no one can tell you what the Matrix is. You know, the only choice you have is the pill. You got to take the pill. And at the time, I'm like, why? Why can't you say, listen, Neo, you're living in a simulation. You're actually in this pod. This thing is hooked up to the back of your head. Why can no one tell you that? And I feel the same way here. It's like, at this point, the Talosians are controlling the ship. Why can't Spock just say, listen, this is what we want to do? And the reason is because, like the Matrix thing, it's not dramatic. What's dramatic is to withhold information. But here's my other thought about this. If the whole point is that really the Talosians are going to be nice to Captain Pike and take good care of him because they actually care about him, why are they showing some of the horrible things that they do to him and Vina, which they're going to do in the next sequence? Like, and the reason is because Gene Roddenberry wanted to show his whole pilot, not because this all actually tracks and fits together that well. That's my feeling.
You're wondering why the Talosians are showing this? Well, I think Pike knows they're showing it for effect for Kirk. The second Pike has that one beep to allow it to continue, Pike is now complicit in the situation with Spock. And so because he's complicit and he understands what Spock's going to do because he tried to stop him from doing this, so he knows exactly what Spock's going to do, him looking at this footage isn't going to affect him in a negative way. And he understands it's being done so that Kirk gets a bigger, broader view of what's happening here.
Well, let me put forth this question, and maybe we'll address it sort of at the end. Well, if I were going to try to convince somebody to stay with me, I would withhold the footage of me torturing them. That's the first thing. It doesn't make sense for the Talosians to show that part of it. But here's actually the bigger question, and we can wait till we get to the end to address it. But the basic idea that makes this okay, that Pike is going to stay with the Talosians, is that they've changed. Because they're villains in the episode The Cage. Yes, they convinced them to leave, but only by suicide. And other than that, they've had no problems torturing Vina for decades. Right. You know? So do we, and this is the question, and that's why I say we could talk about it at the end. Do we actually feel that the Talosians have changed and are going to take good care of Captain Pike at the end of this episode?
I'm going to say what we see happen in the end of the Menagerie on Talos IV is different from what we see happen at the end of The Cage on Talos IV. But even by the end of The Cage in its original form, you see that there is an epiphany that happens within the Keeper that causes the Keeper to become more compassionate towards Pike and Vina. So I think even at that point, there was something implanted in the Talosians to be more compassionate towards humans, and just more compassionate in general, which is what led to the agreement that even took place for Spock to bring Pike to Talos IV.
Right.
Like they had to have been in touch and talked about it, and that must have happened because the Talosians, even back 13 years ago, learned something about humanity, learned something about themselves, and have been evolving in that way ever since.
I think that's why them showing this stuff is not a big deal, because Pike knows what the end is. In the end, they came to a resolution. He came to an understanding that they didn't know what they were doing with a human being. They were trying to figure out how to make the human being, how to do all these kinds of stuff. And like, would you say if you were a scientist, would you say if you watched the scientist not torture, but like experiment on a mouse, if you saw it from the mouse's point of view, the mouse would hate the human being, but the human being might be your friend and is trying to figure out something to help the species overall. So is the human being a villain as a scientist because they're trying to experiment on the mice to help the overall populace, or to understand the mice, or what have you? Are they like let's go to the shark thing, Steve. Like you've spent a lot of time with sharks. When they're tagging these sharks, is this something they want to be tagged? Does the shark look at it and go, "Don't put that on me"? Does the shark feel that way? We don't know. But if the shark could talk and they said that, how would you look at would your point of view change about it? That's basically what I'm getting at. I get that it could look like the Talosians are torturing, but they're trying to figure out. Remember, they built her from scratch too, and they had no game plan, no blueprint.
So several things about this. The first is, if I'm a mouse and I have been tortured by some scientists, or my friend has been tortured by some scientists, those scientists are evil. There's no question in my mind. If I'm a mouse, okay, that feels pretty obvious. And if the scientist said, no, come back this time, even though I'm going to create all sorts of illusions, I promise I'm going to be cool, I would have some trepidation. Now, if I were a mouse that was trapped in a body that I couldn't control, then maybe I would go, hey, maybe it's worth a shot because I don't have anything now. I'm not saying that's not motivatable. As far as the sharks, this is a complicated issue that has gradations. Right. So there have been animal experiments in the past that are just clearly torture. I mean, that, and to the point of where literally they're going, what is the pain tolerance of this chimpanzee? At what point will its heart give out? I mean, there are all sorts of experiments that are just heinous. Yeah. And the ones and I know there are different kinds of tags. So there's some tags that are relatively small. There's not a lot of nerve endings in the fin. And so and it has no effect on them as they're moving. There's some tags where they actually pull a great white shark out of the water and are pouring seawater through its gills so it can stay alive. But because the shark's body is not made out of mostly bone, it's cartilage, the body is like collapsing. And it takes, and they drill a hole with a drill through the fin to insert this big tag. That seems pretty damn terrible.
Yeah.
And that's none of the scientists I worked with use that kind of tag. But then the other thing about it, and this is what the scientists would tell you, is that sharks are hunted. It's like 100 million sharks killed a year. There's not a lot of protections for them. They're really important animals in the ocean. And the more scientists can find out about them, the more sympathy they can get. So even though they might be hurting that individual shark, we're trying to save sharks in general.
Right.
So I know that was obviously a digression, but this is Enterprise incidents. This is
That's
what we're really
we do.
all about.
We digress.
Is there any way I can keep them from probing my mind and from using my thoughts against me?
Fool.
And since you're not real, there's not much point in continuing this conversation, is there?
For anyone who ever wondered why the cage didn't sell, this is why right here. Talking about controlling, using illusions, so that the Talosians can live through them. Where is the action adventure in that? And you're not even getting to the point where the Talosians wanted Pike and Vina to reproduce and create a whole race of slaves. I mean, you're wondering why NBC said, nah, let's try that again and let's pump up the action and pump up the energy. Well, this is as great a scene as it is, and as terrific as Susan Oliver is holding her own with Jeffrey Hunter, and as commanding, so to speak, as Jeffrey Hunter is as Pike, you absolutely see why right here, why this was just a little too cerebral for the taste of NBC.
Well, and so the thing that came up, and we'll address it, and I'm curious to hear what John's thought are. My feeling is it's too damn sexual. I mean, there's some kind of filthy stuff that particularly the cage, even more than the Menagerie, gets into. And this scene ends with, she gives him some information, and then it ends with her screaming, "Please don't punish me," and she disappears, leaving the dress behind. John, you're Captain Pike. You're in this cage right now. How are you feeling about this situation?
Well, clearly how he felt. He's concerned about her. He's worried about the situation. And how he can save her, because the prime directive is essentially, right, not to mess with the function of a planet, the function of a species. But when you see a human being in peril, your natural instinct is there to save the human being. So I think he's trying to negotiate both situations. Like, how do I save her and how do I stop them from torturing her and keeping me in the cage? But I ask you guys this, is this done on purpose by the Talosians? And I thought about this as I was watching it this time. When she's screaming and I can't, is that done for effect? Are they torturing her to see what his reaction to her reacting this way is going to be? Because later she complains they don't give her enough time when they bring other women into the situation. So it's an interesting, really kind of messed up relationship she has. And I think there's probably plenty of psychiatrists, psychologists who look at the whole idea of the Stockholm Syndrome situation, and also a woman being kept by these older creatures and what that would feel like, or species rather, what that whole weird kind of complex relationship would be. So there's a lot to explore here than what we're just seeing.
100%, John. I think it's done for effect. And the Talosians even say, we're going to give him something to protect this time. And then later on, when he's talking to them, they say, oh yeah, now a feeling of protection. Excellent. They are 100% making him feel protective over the girl by punishing her, by putting her in difficult situations. Totally.
Yeah.
And now we have a very brief and fairly useless cut back to the trial. And then we have the next scene in the cage where he wakes up and refuses to drink the food that they've given him.
You overlook the unpleasant alternative of punishment.
And then he is essentially in hell. This scared the crap out of me when I was a kid.
Scares the crap out of me now.
And the other thing that he discovers when they let him back and he does acquiesce into eating whatever this food is he out of nowhere attacks the wall and the keeper is startled. And this is where he learns a key lesson. They can't read through primitive emotions.
Yeah.
Let's go on a picnic. I think this is the central scene to the show. I also think it's interesting some of the things that are cut out here is that we're in one of the fantasies that Pike talked about in the scene with the doctor, which is with his horses, except now he has Vina as his wife on a picnic. The horse is the one that he remembers. The keepers actually put sugar in his pocket because they think of everything. And she is trying to create a world of, this is our marriage. This could be our life.
You're home. You can even stay if you want.
But we're not here, neither of us. We're in a menagerie, a cage.
No.
What's really interesting with the picnic scene, I think, is what they cut. Because this is one of the few places where they genuinely changed some of the things that are in the cage. One of them is that as she's trying to be the wife and he's not playing along, she talks about, remember the headaches that I get. I'm getting those headaches again. Well, that to me is, remember that I could be tortured if you don't play along with this thing. Mm-hmm. They also cut out where he actually references the scene with the doctor and that he's now getting this idea of we have to go out and fight and skin knees and we're not supposed to have, which is a classic Star Trek theme. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting that those are things they chose to cut out.
Pike doesn't want to be in an illusion at all, whether it's being on a picnic back at home with Tango and the sugar in his jacket, or and of course Vina, but he also doesn't want to be an Orion slave trader, which is, that image of Susan Oliver covered in green makeup, courtesy of the great Fred Phillips, who did the makeup for the cage in the original series. Mm-hmm. First of all, I have to say Susan Oliver's performance in this entire episode of the cage is just fantastic. She's so committed, and there's a lot of range there. And the music, that music that they actually did reuse when they went to the second season for Wolf in the Fold, that great classic music of the dance scene. Mm-hmm. And Susan Oliver was just terrific especially in this portion, looking so sensual while covered in green makeup. And that sensuality was irresistible for Pike.
Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting is that when we go to the Orion slave girl sequence, in the cage, we stay there and it's all as one sequence. And here we start it, see the Orion slave girl, we realize it's Vina, and then we go back to the trial. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really interesting choice. Why do you think they choose to cut out in the middle of it?
Well, I think for two reasons. For one, to kind of remind you that you are watching this as part of a trial. And also, maybe there's a little bit of exposition here in some ways, where they're just trying to make sure that people who were watching, again, everybody was warned, the cage is too cerebral. So now we're using everything from the cage in the menagerie. Let's make sure that people get what's going on here. I think that was part. It was more of a narrative choice to make sure that people were following along instead of a creative one.
I think they're aiming for an act break. So that's part of it. Like one of the things, and I actually think this is something I really learned from Star Trek, is that act breaks in TV give writers destinations. Is that, I need to build to a moment to end the act. So that creates a certain rhythm in television that doesn't exist in film. Mm-hmm. This happens to be, in my opinion, a fairly weak act break. But the other thing I think they're doing is they're subtly changing the nature of what's going on. Because what Mendez says about the Orion slave girl is he says,
they're like animals, vicious, seductive. They say no human male can resist them.
What that does is it makes Pike more passive in the sense that this is a situation he's being put into that he's going to have trouble resisting, not as much a fantasy that he wants. It's a different framing. And when we come back in Act 3 to the Orion slave girl, we also hear Kirk say,
strange evidence from the past. How the Talosians tempted Captain Pike with the Earth woman they held in captivity. And as she appeared to him in many forms, each more exciting than the last, Pike was beginning to weaken.
That's different from what's happening in the cage. This really frames it as this thing that is happening to Pike. Mm-hmm. And this is the key one. There was a line that's in the cage that is not in the menagerie, and I think it is really key. And that line is, they're talking about the Orion slave girls, and one of the scummy guys that is sitting with Pike says, funny how they are on this planet. They actually like being taken advantage of. And that line is removed in the Menagerie. And what I think this is why I go like cutting out in the middle of the Orion slave girl, describing her as something that no man can resist, and taking out this line changes it from Pike has fantasies of essentially rape fantasies or taking advantage or owning slaves to Pike is put in a situation with this alien species that he's not going to be able to resist. Those are very, very different, in my opinion.
Yeah. I had forgotten that he'd wanted to be a slave trader. Like in my mind, I'm like, how do you talk about it so casually with the Doctor? And so that shows you like Star Trek had a different point of view when it shot this pilot than what they ended up becoming when they finally went forward with William Shatner in the lead as Kirk. This idea that he would even consider that as a job, to even have a conversation about, for God's sakes. And especially this is the early 60s, mid 60s when this is being shot as a pilot. So it seems like an even worse time to be even considering that situation.
Yeah, they shot the Cage. The first day of shooting on the Cage was November 27th, 1964.
Yeah.
So, that's really early. But by those standards or today's standards, it was definitely a good move for them to take that portion of the dialogue out of the Menagerie, because even in the mid 60s, it is just, whoa, hang on.
It's some heavy stuff.
Very weird. Yeah.
Right.
So, and we end up and I actually think that the way this is handled and the music and sound design is better in the Menagerie, of him getting up and leaving and then ending up in the cave with Vina and the door has disappeared. I think structurally it's done a lot better. And then what's about to happen is that the crew of the Enterprise is going to try to beam down, and that the only people that end up beaming down are the women.
The women!
Here's the thing I was thinking about this time. If they don't beam down, does Pike have sex with Vina as the Orion slave girl?
No. I mean, I
don't know.
Well, okay, because I see what you're saying. Because when they beamed down, something was happening.
Yeah.
There's a moment where, in the illusion that Vina has her arms wrapped around Pike, she's like kind of just measuring him, so to speak. And then the women show up and she's like, no, let me finish.
Yeah.
So does she finish? And does Pike let her finish? That's a great question. That is a great question. Should we pose that to our...
Yeah, sure. Well, and particularly with the line that no man can resist them, and Pike was beginning to weaken. That's how it's set up here, which is different from in the Cage. So given what we know, and given the way that Pike turns to Vina in the moment he sees her as the Orion slave girl in the Cage, and the moment we see in the actual Cage with Vina and her arms around Pike when the women show up, if the women hadn't showed up, would Pike have had sex with the Orion slave girl?
Wow, that is a Saved by the Bell moment on the part of number one and Gilman Cult. Wow, that's a great question.
Or not Saved by the Bell.
Yeah, I mean, totally.
A lot of people have been in a situation where they thought they were about to have a moment, and then someone came in,
Right, yeah.
But they do show up. They show up in the Cage, and now what we hear is that these are essentially other potential mates.
The female you call number one has the superior mind and would produce highly intelligent children.
Have we gotten to the point where Vina says about Majel Barrett,
I'd have more luck crossing him with a computer?
And then Majel does this little half look, which I think is done a little bit as a kind of an in-joke, a meta joke a little bit in that moment. I've never caught that till watching it this time. And I don't know why I caught it this time, but when I caught it, I was like, oh, Majel did a nice job. Just a little it was brilliant. So I love that.
One of the things Scott and I talked about when we went through the Cage, and I think Scott, that you agreed. I think number one is Majel Barrett's best Star Trek role.
I couldn't agree more. Oh. And watching her again,
yes,
I think, even after all these years and all the various ways that Star Trek has changed and evolved through all of the shows, even up to and including Discovery, and you have a great character like played by Sonequa Martin Green, Michael Burnham. I still think that even by today's standards, the quality of the character of number one absolutely holds up. And even by today's standards, she is an amazing character and a trailblazing character. And the fact that Roddenberry had her there at the beginning, but he also had Spock. And the network said, you can't keep them both. So he kept Spock and he married number one.
The other new arrival has considered you unreachable, but now is realizing this has changed. The factors in her favor are youth and strength, plus unusually strong female drives.
Okay, now let me say something about those unusually strong female drives. Clearly, I'm not going where you think I'm going with this, Johnny. But where I am going with it is in this portion of Star Trek, in the cage portion of Star Trek, they are setting up that the captain's yeoman has a thing for the captain.
Yes.
Now, obviously, almost everybody except for Mr. Spock was recast when they went to the second pilot and went to series. So must have been something about that dynamic between the captain and the captain's yeoman and the affection between them, which has to be very, very, very much dialed back, that Roddenberry must have liked, because that was something that he set up in the original series with Captain Kirk and Yeoman Rand. Yeah. And there were a couple episodes there, and we've talked about this at length on Enterprise Incidents, about the relationship between Kirk and Rand and how, her affection for him was more obvious than his for her, although his for her was definitely there. And it was a shame that they never were able to sort of evolve that relationship further, because Rand was written out of the series. But it was a very interesting epiphany that I had watching the Menagerie, going, oh, I get it. Yeoman Colt is Yeoman Rand and Kirk is Pike.
Yeah, that's actually it's the same thing I thought as well, that they certainly had an idea that this was something they wanted to explore with Yeoman Rand. And there are hints of it at times, but then they don't fully, as you said, Scott, don't fully dial into it. And then eventually she's written off the show. But yeah, you could see they had an idea of keeping this relationship, at least, or the hint of this possibility, in the new version of the show.
One thread that is taken out is the thread of number one's attraction to Captain Pike. It's set up on the show in the cage, where at the very beginning he says to number one, well, I don't think of you as a woman. And she has a look. And then there's a line that's missing from this scene, which is when they introduce number one and that she has the superior brain, the keeper also says,
although she seems to lack emotion, this is largely a pretense. She often has fantasies involving you.
But that is cut out of the cage. And while this is going on, Pike is trying to use what he learned, negative, primitive emotions, to lock them out. And their response to that is to torture him. What another scene they cut, which I think is a good thing, is at this moment in the cage, we go back to the Enterprise and Spock says, we're leaving, because they were trying to bug out. That was a good one to cut. It's later on. Everyone's asleep, and the keeper sneaks in through the hole, and Pike wakes up, puts him on the ground, and starts strangling him, and he turns into some giant monster.
You stop the solution or I'll twist your head off.
So in many ways, Pike is smarter than Kirk, but in other ways, he's not as much of a people person as Kirk. Or at least he's on Kirk's level in terms of intelligence. He finds things out his own way.
Well, Pike uses his latest moment with the Keeper to put his theory to rest, because he's got his phaser and he's got the Keeper in a headlock. He points the phaser at the cage door. He fires the phaser. Nothing happens. Then he points to, I love it. He pulls his version of the Corbomite maneuver.
Totally.
Because he says, I think I just blasted a hole through this wall and you're keeping us from seeing it. I'm going to test my theory out on your head right now. And then the Talosian reveals that he did blow the hole through the wall. And I mean, obviously the Corbomite maneuver was a much, much bigger, grander risk, but it is still, because we only see Christopher Pike, played by Jeffrey Hunter, just this one time, that's his version of it. And they go through the door, but the transmission suddenly stops. And we're back in the during the hearing, and the Talosians have stopped and they've deserted Spock, and Spock is basically pleading, just wait, let's wait a little bit more time. And the Commodore says, I need your verdicts. And Pike says guilty, Mendez says guilty, and Captain Kirk struggles to say the words. It hurts him so much.
Guilty as charged.
He is sentencing his loyal first officer and his friend. And this is after Spock defended him in court-martial.
So this is where my criticisms of the envelope portion of the show exist, which is, first of all, why did the transmission stop? And the reason it stopped is because we have to fill up some extra time. We need an act break. We want Kirk to say guilty. And this, remember in the last episode when we were talking about, and I said, I just had that moment of, ooh, Kirk versus Spock. Wouldn't that have been cool? Wouldn't it have been cool if we had seen somewhere in here Kirk talking to Scotty and saying, how can we stop these transmissions? We need to get control of the ship again. And it was something that Kirk did that caused the transmission to stop, rather than it just stops so we can have this scene, which is kind of how it feels to me.
Okay, so we're in Act 4, and the actual Enterprise, commanded by Kirk, is now at Talos IV, and that brings us back to the story within the story, where we're back on the surface with Pike and Vina and Number One and Colt and the Keeper. And the Keeper basically says, okay.
With the female of your choice, you will now begin carefully guided lives.
And basically, Number One makes this move, not the captain. She puts her laser, because it's not called a phaser yet, but she puts her phaser into the overload position to basically sacrifice themselves, because they would rather die than be forced to do what they're doing and to live as slaves.
The customs and history of your race show a unique hatred of captivity. Even when it's pleasant and benevolent, you prefer death. This makes you too violent and dangerous a species for our needs.
Do you think this, just like a scientist, right? We're all intelligent, man, but just like a scientist, they had Vina and they had her reactions to being caged, her reactions to the illusion. She has nowhere else to go because we're about to find out her physical nature. But do you think they needed other human beings to be able to verify their hypothesis about human beings? So this is why they went through all this stuff with Pike, with Number One, with the yeoman there. That was the whole reason for all of this. So now that they have their information, they're reaffirming what Vina has probably felt or told them at times. You know, I'd rather die. You know, there are probably moments where she's said in exultation, like, I'd rather die. This is tearing me apart. I want to die. But she doesn't, obviously. And I wonder if this is that moment when they're having that conversation, it reinforces this idea. Because the Talosian is so shocked. The Keeper is so shocked. He's just like, I can't, this makes no sense to me. And it's like, you know, because we think we're giving you an illusion to live in. But in fact, the human nature, it mirrors something you brought up earlier, Steve, The Matrix, right? Where Mr. Anderson, or no, sorry, where Hugo Weaving's character says to, no, it was the creator, the architect, says to him, we tried different iterations of the construct of the world, and we made everybody happy, and humans naturally rejected it because they don't believe people can be universally happy. And so it's so interesting how they have this idea of how they think human beings will react to things, and they have to learn that human beings have a natural desire to be free and a natural skepticism about everything. So I love that.
Well, certainly you gone on to one of the classic Star Trek themes, which is the anti-utopian, is that we need struggle, we need pain. That's what we need in order to be human. One of the interesting things, I think, and the contrast between the cage and the menagerie that makes it so interesting is, well, how do we feel about the Talosians? Like, because like you brought up frame them as scientists. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing. And I think that's
how I see them.
That is part of what they are. But they are also people who are desperate, who are basically devoid of all emotions and need the humans in order to live emotional lives through them. And so in that sense, they're kind of parasites. And the balance between learning stuff like scientists and being slavers who are going to live through your slaves. And I don't know where I stand. I don't know how I feel about the Talosians.
Do you see them as slavers, really? I'll tell you right now.
Of course, they're definitely what they're doing is they not only are they putting people to slavery, they're having them have babies and putting them to slavery. Like that's their motive. Like that's what they want to repopulate the planet with human slaves. But also,
all right.
yeah. I mean, I thought that was I always thought that was the case.
I know, but I don't see them that way. I actually see them as scientists who are trying to figure out the human species. And when this whole situation happens, they're awoken to what humans actually are, but they offer a paradise if you want it. And this paradise is not a paradise where they're being with slaves like we've seen in our American history, whipped and with the, things on. It's like you can live the utopian life if you want. You're repopulating the planet, and in your mind, the illusion of this utopia will exist. So I don't see them necessarily as enslavers. I see your point of view, though. I just have never seen them that way.
I absolutely, especially when you get to this reveal of why they wanted Pike to stay with Vina, was absolutely to repopulate the planet and to enslave the population. They are absolutely enslavers, and slavery is. I mean, there's nothing subtle about it. Slavery has been going on for all of human history. When you look at, ancient Egypt, and when you look at the 19th century, with slavery in the United States. So the Talosians are offering a manufactured form of paradise.
Yeah.
And in every situation where Kirk's Enterprise is offered a manufactured form of paradise, whether it's through Landru in Return of the Archons, through Apollo in Who Mourns for Adonais, through the Spores in This Side of Paradise, and through Val on the Apple, Kirk says no, because it is not a natural form of paradise. It is a manufactured and manipulated form of paradise. Right. And it is such an overt form of paradise that even Kirk says, we need challenges. We take away those challenges, we die. So there was a great speech here that Pike could have really given, that Kirk would have given if it was further along in the series. But it is still a trope that is used many, many times in a very good way throughout all the Star Trek shows, not just the original series. But I definitely think the Talosians are enslavers. Steve, agree, disagree?
So I completely understand John's point, because this is a really, really weird form of enslavement, because it is, as you say, on some levels offering you paradise. Live in any world you want, eat any food you want, be with any woman you want, have any experience you want. Sounds like paradise. But it is one in which they want them to behave in a certain way. You must mate with this person. You must eat this food. You must do what I say. And like in slavery, torture is involved. If you do not comply with the master's wishes, you will be tortured. Well, and this is what I think makes the cage / the menagerie such an anomalous thing, which is, again, I go to, how do we feel about the Talosians? Like, is this going to be a cool thing?
Let's get back to the ship.
I can't go with you.
And of course, what we see is the reason that Vina cannot go on the Enterprise, which is that she is put together incorrectly. She's unhealthy. Yeah. The only way for her to live with the illusion of beauty is to stay on the planet. And another one of the differences is in the cage, she goes up the rocks with an illusion version of Captain Pike. And in the menagerie, she has her illusion of beauty again, but is alone.
When Pike goes back to the Enterprise, and number one's like, what about Vina?
Isn't she coming with us?
No, and I agreed with her reasons.
But he keeps it to himself. Like, I don't know if he must have told like Spock about it at some point, because that's when Spock, after Pike was hurt, got the idea to bring Pike to Talos IV and work with the Talosians in that capacity. But the look on Kirk's face, like when he is in the briefing room during the hearing and he realizes everything that's going on, and then he turns to the Commodore.
Commodore, don't you think that...
And the Commodore disappears. Like, the whole big revelation, like everything comes to the fore at this moment. And Kirk realizes everything that has happened, why it's happened, the lengths that which Spock went through to bring his former captain back, and why.
Mr. Spock, even if regulations are explicit, you could have come to me and explained.
Ask you to face the death penalty, too. One of us was enough, Captain.
The heart of this two-part series is right there at this moment, and it is beating very strong.
I think Nimoy's performance at that moment is so good because you see he's so world weary, I think, and you see what he's been carrying. He's been carrying the burden of, I might have to destroy this relationship with the captain I love in order to save the life of the other captain that I feel a deep sense of loyalty to. And that pressure of that decision, he's finally made it to the end. I think it's an amazing moment. I agree. So here's my question. If you were Captain Pike at the time of the Menagerie and captured by the Talosians, would you stay with them?
No.
If you were Captain Pike in the chair, would you stay with the Talosians?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you something real quick too. We just did on the top 10 films about elderly ensemble casts or elderly leads, right? And I rewatched Away From Her, one of the most devastating movies.
I love that movie.
Right? It's brilliant, Scott.
Beautiful movie.
About Alzheimer's. And I thought to myself, and I might get emotional here, I love my girlfriend so much. And I'm going to, the lady out, I love her to pieces. If something was to happen to her like that, or if I was to lose her in some way, I'll be honest with you, I would feel like Captain Pike in the chair, having spent so long of my life trying to find someone to spend the rest of my life with. And I found the perfect one, that I would want to lose myself in a fake reality for the rest of my life. Like the Matrix does, like we see in the Upgrade, this idea that if what he is here on Earth is no longer keeping you here on Earth, creating an illusion where you can live with that person that you've always wanted to live with until your body actually dies in your mind, to live in that world and fool yourself that world is real, I would take it in a heartbeat. If I was in Captain Pike's situation, I would. Not even a question.
If I'm on Talos IV at the beginning, absolutely not. I would not want to be a prisoner like that, even if I was living out the fantasies of all my illusions, because you know what? That would get old because I would run out of things to do and I would not be living a real life. I mean, I want to be in the reality. But the other side of your question there, like what if I was Pike in the Menagerie and I had a chance to live out the rest of my life unfettered by my physical disabilities? Yes, I would absolutely do that, because it might not be reality, but I would still have a quality of life that's better than the one that I had.
There's no question for me, if I'm in that chair, I'm going to go, I want to be with the Talosians. The other one is, I wish there was a way I could say to the Talosians, hey, Keeper, can we make a deal? Can I be here like a couple of months a year? Like, I'll totally hang out here, have sex with the Orion girl, go off on crazy adventures, have some fun, but then actually leave and go accomplish things, because I actually like work. I like challenges. I like to accomplish things, and living in a world where that doesn't exist would get real old real quick. But I'd be happy to visit. You could read my emotions and we could have some fun, and then I could send someone else and you can hang out with them. Let's make a deal, Mr. Keeper.
Absolutely. Sure. No, listen, I just think that the Menagerie is a turning point. It is a division between the Star Trek that came before and the Star Trek that would come after, because it was right after this episode that the tone of Star Trek would change. And again, that's all Gene Kuhn. He's coming in, he's making Star Trek his own by defining the characters, adding more levity, adding in his own creations, whether it's the Klingons and Khan and it's Starfleet and the United Federation of Planets. So it feels like a very, very different show. And it's almost like it's so great that this 2-part episode that looks back on the Star Trek that really started it all production-wise marks the end of the beginning for Star Trek, because what was the best was truly yet to come. So, John, what are your final thoughts on the Menagerie?
I think it's one of the most signature moments in Star Trek, not just episodes. And of course, as Scott and Steve mentioned, it's the first 2-parter, just moments. I think this is where the show turned the corner. I think this is where the show showed you what it was really capable of and what it could really explore and what its point of view was and what they were going for, by going back to the past to show you where they started or what they had initially thought Star Trek was going to be, and then showing you what it became 11 episodes into the first season. It's just a brilliant showcase for what the show would become. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the part one, it is the 2 episodes that made me fall in love with Star Trek. And I've never fallen out of love with Star Trek ever since. Great performances all around. Great discussions about about all the concepts that are presented throughout the Menagerie, and at the end of the day, the differences between Kirk as a captain and Pike as a captain, but the love that Kirk, or the respect Kirk has, as well as love for Pike, is there when he calls him Chris. Right? No one else calls him Chris. And there's something about that moment where he's leaning in, right? There is an acceptance, because you say, well, they're enslavers. I get that, but they're still going to receive Captain Pike and they're going to give him a new life. And there's a magnanimity to that, in my opinion, that I love and respect about these 2 episodes of the Menagerie. And it'll never stop being my favorite episode of Star Trek. It just won't. I love it to pieces.
Here are my final thoughts on this episode. I think I like it the least of the 3 of us. We discussed in incredible detail my feelings about the cage. I feel like the envelope episode could have been so much more. I guess that's if there's so many times where it feels like we're filling space, we're doing exposition. We really, really want to use the footage of the cage, and this is how we figured out how to do it. And so for me, it's like, I wish I had seen Kirk be more active. I wish I had seen more engagement of the ideas of what it's like for Pike in the chair. I wish we had more character in terms of Spock's relationship with Pike outside of the flashbacks. But what we do have is the engagement in some really interesting ideas, the exploration of real Star Trek thoughts of captivity and utopia and fantasy versus reality. And I really do enjoy those, but part of me would just imagine something a little more.
Listen, I completely agree with you about the shortcomings of the envelope portion, because for the most part, our main hero, Captain Kirk, is very passive and reactive, and they spend most of the time sitting watching TV, basically. So, it's not a typical Star Trek episode by any measure. But I think the fact that the way that Gene Roddenberry was able to take the unused pilot and to make really great use out of it with an overall 2-part episode that is extremely emotional, and because it was both creative and practical to save money and save time, I think the fact that the episode is as strong as it is a miracle in itself. So it's not the episode or the 2-part that I go back and watch over and over again, because sometimes I just want to watch the cage, and I do. But I think that for what their needs were, he did the best possible thing he could, and Desilu saved some money in the process to help with their deficit spending. And it was a win-win all the way, but I do agree with what you said about it. Now, looking back on the Menagerie, Malachi Throne, who played Commodore Mendez, said, and I quote, "It was hard to get a smile out of Leonard when he was in character. Of course, with Leonard, it was hard to get a smile out of him anyway. He does have a sense of humor, but when he works, he's very serious. Now, Shatner was the opposite. Bill was fun, but he was also forthright and adamant about everything because that was his character." And that kind of goes along with what a lot of guest stars have said about Shatner and Nimoy, that Nimoy was very to himself and very in character, even when the cameras were off, while Shatner was a lot of fun and this ball of energy. And Sean Kenny, who played Captain Pike in the envelope portion of the Menagerie, said, "It was a thrill to be in the show. It was my first film job, and I received top billing in the credits. I'm proud of it because the story said so much, and it was taken so, how shall I say it, emotionally by so many people." Of course, he is referencing the diehard Trekkers.
As one more thing I wanted to say, Scott, we have now done, this is, I believe, our 17th episode of Enterprise Incidents. At 16 episodes, we crossed the 20% mark. We have now talked about 1/5 of the original series.
That, I got to tell you, Steve, I was thinking about that when I was doing my notes, that, wow, this is our 17th discussion. And we're just really hitting our stride with this. And again, the reactions we've been getting from the fans who've been listening to us on whether it's Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, even the YouTube portion, Google Podcasts, all the ways that people have found Enterprise Incidents and have recommended Enterprise Incidents to other people, which obviously we very much appreciate. But I just think that because the best is yet to come for Star Trek, I think it's safe to say that the best is yet to come with Enterprise Incidents, especially when we keep getting bigger guests.
That's absolutely true. And Scott, you already mentioned all the places you can subscribe to the show. Leave your comments on YouTube. You guys have left some amazing reviews on iTunes. Keep it up. They're fantastic. If you're enjoying the show, it's the number one thing you can do to help us out. On our Facebook page, we are going to post the question about whether or not Pike actually would have had sex with Vina as the Orion slave girl. And maybe when we'd like to find out, would you stay with the Talosians, either as Pike who's healthy or Pike in the chair? And of course, you can follow the show at Enterprise Incidents on Instagram, on Enter Incidents on Twitter. You can follow me at SR Morris on Twitter, SR Morris1 on Instagram. Scott, what about you?
You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Movie Mance. You can check out my YouTube page for all my film content, which is just Scott Mance on YouTube.
So, John, if people wanted to reach you on the internet, in social media, how would they go about doing that?
Well, I'm on Talos IV. No, you can find me at The Rocha Says on Twitter and on Instagram. And please head on over to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/John Rocha Says. I hope I'll be getting these two gentlemen to come on again and be guests on some of my shows there in the future. I love having both of them on there. And there's so much great content and new content we're putting on there as well. And of course, don't forget the Top 10 and the Geek Buddies podcast that I do. And I want to send a special thank you to both Scott Manson and Steve Morris for having me on here. I love Star Trek. I rarely get to dive in deep as much as I do with you two. So thank you very much for having me. And thanks to everybody who's listened.
Well, the pleasure is definitely ours, Steve and John. I mean, doing this with you, look, John, if it wasn't for you, I never would have met Steve. So
that's true.
It is I who should be thanking you. So I'm very, very grateful for that because Enterprise Incidents has just been such a great, great joy for me.
You can tell.
John, thank you so much for coming on the show, and I can't wait to talk to you in a day or two, probably for the Cine-Files.
Agreed. Thanks, guys.
And you can be sure to join us for the very next episode of Enterprise Incidents. You know, it's been, the year we've been out in space so far, it's been a lot of work. Man, we need a break. How about some shore leave?
So excited about that. Cannot wait.
Cannot wait for shore leave because I'll tell you, if there is any episode that really stands out from the rest of the series for being so different in so many ways, this is the one. We cannot wait to do our deep dive on shore leave. Join us on the next episode of Enterprise Incidents. And until then, keep going boldly.